People worship his name, but I see nothing but an old man hiding behind stories. The words cracked across the gym, louder than a punch landing. Even the rhythm of fists hitting heavy bags faltered. The Dallas Recreation Hall, usually filled with the thud of training pads and the chatter of families, suddenly hummed with silence. Dozens of heads turned toward the corner where the target of the insult sat. Chuck Norris was there. No spotlight, no entourage, just a plain jacket and jeans, his hands folded loosely on his knees. He'd come quietly, like anyone else, to watch the regional karate tournament. Parents had been whispering about it all morning. "That's him, right?" That's really Chuck Norris kids peeked at him between matches, their eyes wide, some too shy to ask for an autograph, others nudging each other just to say they'd been in the same room. Now every eye had a reason to stare. In the middle of the mats stood the challenger, a 25-year-old black belt with a swagger that outpaced his experience. He was tall, lean, quick on his feet, and buzzing with the kind of energy that turns confidence into recklessness. His GI was immaculate, his belt tied tight, chest rising and falling faster than calm would allow. He grinned after the insult, trying to look relaxed, but his voice had cracked on the last word. His friends along the bleachers shouted encouragement, feeding him bravado. Laughter trickled through the gym. Not all of it was friendly. Some chuckled nervously, uncertain whether it was wise to provoke a man whose name had long ago slipped from martial arts into myth. A few teenagers clapped, delighted at the show. Others just stared at Chuck, as if expecting him to rise instantly, to prove the legend true. The children in the front row were the most unsettled. They looked from the cocky young fighter to the silent man in the corner, their mouths tight, eyes searching. For them, Chuck Norris wasn't just a name. He was the embodiment of discipline and strength, the reason some of them had even started karate. The insult landed on their faces too, like second-hand embarrassment. Chuck did not move. He didn't frown, didn't smirk, didn't roll his shoulders like someone preparing to stand. He simply lifted his eyes. The shift was small, but the effect was immediate. The young fighter's grin faltered for a beat. The gym, loud just seconds earlier, grew so quiet you could hear the squeak of sneakers on polished floor in the far corner. It wasn't a cinematic pause. It was heavier, stranger, as if everyone sensed something had tipped but couldn't name it. Chuck's gaze held steady. Not aggressive, not amused. Just a quiet recognition, the way a mountain looks at the weather. His stillness drew the attention away from the challenger's words, away from the laughter, and focused it back on the man who had given nothing of himself, and yet commanded everything. Parents whispered to each other in the bleachers. Coaches leaned forward, curious. Even the referees shifted on their feet, unsure whether they should intervene or let the moment play. The young black belt cleared his throat, trying to shake it off. He raised his hands in mock surrender, calling to the crowd, "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Legends fade. He gestured toward Chuck again, louder this time, needing the reassurance of noise. His supporters clapped and whooped, but the reaction from the rest of the gym was muted. The silence following Chuck's single lifted glance had already taken root. Kids in crisp white GIs stared, gripping their belts tight. A woman in the back row whispered, "Don't do it, kid." A local reporter adjusted his camera tripod, sensing this was no longer just another Saturday tournament. And Chuck remained still. The quiet became unbearable, a tension thicker than the scent of sweat and liniment in the air. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of presence, of a man who had lived too many battles to waste words on noise. The young fighter shifted on his feet, his grin tightening at the edges. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. But the longer Chuck refused to give it, the louder the weight of that refusal became. And as the crowd leaned closer, waiting for a spark, the only question anyone could think, even if they didn't dare say it out loud, was this: would Chuck Norris let the insult pass, or was the storm about to begin? The young black belt didn't let the silence settle. He planted himself in the middle of the mat, chest out, voice pitched for the rafters. If he's really who they say he is, let him prove it here and now. Half the gym erupted, teenagers drumming on bleachers, parents leaning forward with phones raised. The other half groaned, shaking heads, muttering that it had gone too far. The place no longer felt like a family tournament. It felt like an arena waiting for blood. The challenger laughed too loudly, needing the crowd to keep him upright. "Come on," he added, sweeping an arm toward the corner. "Legends don't hide." His friends whistled and stomped, but their noise didn't fill the silence from the rest of the room. Chuck rose. The scrape of his chair legs across the varnished floor cut through the gym like a blade. The shift was unhurried, not a reaction to the shout, but a decision on its own terms. He stepped into the aisle, hands loose at his sides, his face unreadable. Kids shuffled out of his way as if the painted boundary lines suddenly carried heat. Phones snapped up in a wave. He walked to the edge of the mat, stopping in front of the referees. A silent question hung in his eyes. The head official, a woman with gray streaking her braid, hesitated, then gave a single nod. Her voice carried just enough. Demonstration only. Controlled contact. Respect. That last word lingered. Chuck stepped onto the mat and bowed deeply. The young fighter's bow was quick, shallow, the kind you give when you want the moment over. Chuck straightened and took his stance without flourish, his breathing steady. The crowd leaned forward, their voices tangled in a low hum. Someone killed the background music, and the sudden absence made every shuffle and cough sound magnified. The young black belt spun his shoulders, rolled his neck, then grinned at Chuck. "You ready, sir?" The "sir" came late, awkward, forced. Chuck's reply was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the entire gym. "Respect isn't given. It's earned." The room froze. The teenagers stopped jeering. Parents exchanged looks. Even the referee gave a small nod. The young fighter's grin faltered before he covered it with another laugh. "Then earn this," he said, clapping his fists together. The referee stepped between them, checked their distance, then stepped back. The kid attacked immediately. Sharp jab, cross, sweeping kick that slapped the air loudly enough to draw cheers. Chuck didn't move. He watched, calm, his eyes following hips and shoulders, not the hands. The fighter circled, throwing feints and showy hops, playing to the bleachers more than his opponent. "I don't see it," he taunted. His friends echoed him, but their voices cracked in the strange quiet that had overtaken the rest of the room. Chuck's stillness made each miss more obvious. He wasn't dodging wildly, just shifting inches, letting the strikes cut air. To the untrained eye, it looked like he barely moved at all. To those who knew, it looked like control of the highest order. The young man's breathing quickened, his cheeks reddening. He flurried harder, jab, cross, hook, kick, high enough to make the crowd gasp. Chuck slid a single step, and the kick brushed by his cheek with an inch to spare. The sound of it, a hollow woof, hit the audience like a ghost of contact. Gasps rose from the bleachers. Even those who'd wanted a show now leaned forward, hushed. A girl in the front whispered, "He didn't even move," and the words spread in murmurs across the rows. The challenger, stung, reset his stance too tightly. He lunged again, throwing everything into a right cross. Chuck finally answered. A short, precise lift of the knee. A snap of the foot, direct and economical. He stopped his kick just an inch from the young fighter's face. The control was absolute, close enough that the boy could feel the rush of air on his skin, but with no contact. The gym erupted. Not just in cheering, something heavier, recognition. Parents clapped, kids shouted, even coaches leaned forward, knowing exactly what they'd seen. Mastery disguised as restraint. Chuck held the pose for a breath, then lowered his foot with the care of someone setting a glass on a shelf. His face remained calm, untriumphant. The lesson was clear. The fight could have ended in that instant, but he had chosen not to. The young fighter's eyes widened, pride collapsing under the weight of what nearly happened. The referee hovered, torn between stopping it and letting it go. The audience buzzed, their disbelief turning into awe. And in the middle of the storm, one question echoed louder than any cheer. Why had Chuck stopped short? The roar after Chuck's stopped kick didn't fade so much as fracture. It broke into pockets, cheers, gasps, nervous laughter, before collapsing into a heavy silence. The young black belt stood rigid, his eyes locked on the inch of space where a foot had hovered close enough to taste the air. He forced a grin, but it trembled, and everyone saw it. The head official raised a hand, her voice cutting through the quiet. Controlled. Chuck inclined his head once. The kid mimicked him, but his nod was stiff, his face a mask stretched too tight. Reset, the referee called. They squared again. The gym felt smaller, the walls pressing in with heat from so many bodies leaning forward. The sharp scent of sweat and liniment mixed with the tang of metal from folding chairs. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed, loud enough now to be part of the tension. The challenger tried to find his rhythm, bouncing on his toes, swinging his arms loose. His supporters clapped from the bleachers, chanting his name, desperate to rebuild his swagger. He lunged in, snapping a jab cross, then spun into a high roundhouse that would have looked good on highlight reels. Chuck tilted just enough, and the heel brushed past his cheek. The crowd reacted in unison, a sharp intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. A girl in the front row whispered, "He didn't even move." Her words traveled, muttered from mouth to mouth until the bleachers buzzed with awe. The young fighter reddened, jaw tight. He closed the distance, trying to turn the exchange into a brawl. His arms swung wide, seeking chaos. Chuck didn't strike back. His hands redirected, light as water over stone, each parry leaving the kid more tangled. A half step, a small pivot, and suddenly the challenger's balance vanished. He stumbled, catching himself before falling. But the damage wasn't physical. It was visible. Chuck never followed. He just stood where he was, calm, breathing steady. It was less like fighting an opponent and more like teaching a stubborn student. The silence deepened. Parents lowered their phones, suddenly aware they were watching something not meant for replay. A cameraman crouched low, his red tally light glowing. Coaches muttered to themselves, recognizing what the crowd couldn't yet put into words. The young black belt's chest heaved. Pride pushed him forward again. He spun into a hook kick, heel cutting a bright arc under the lights. Phones shot up, catching the moment. Chuck stepped in, not back, and the kick carved harmless air. His hand hovered near the boy's supporting leg, close enough to sweep, close enough to end it. The bleachers gasped. The entire room froze. But Chuck didn't sweep. He simply straightened, lowering his arm, resetting the space between them. His face stayed calm, unreadable. The young fighter's shoulders sagged without permission, the body's instinctive acknowledgement of mercy. Scattered applause broke out. Not loud, not triumphant, more reverent than celebratory. Coaches nodded, kids sat wide-eyed. For the first time, the young man bowed fully, waist bent, eyes down. His earlier arrogance evaporated. When he rose, his face was different. Less bravado, more weight. The gym felt it. Even the teenagers who had cheered his taunts were quiet now, caught in the gravity of the lesson. "Reset," the referee called again, though her voice carried more awe than authority. They circled. The scoreboard clock ticked loud enough to be heard over held breaths. The young fighter tried one last honest strike, a straight punch, crisp and measured, not showy. Chuck slipped to the side, touched the glove lightly as it passed, and let it go. It was acknowledgement, not dismissal. The boy's chest rose and fell hard. He blinked sweat from his eyes, caught between relief and frustration. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the edge of something final. This wasn't a match anymore. It was a lesson. And everyone in that gym, from the smallest child to the cameraman behind the lens, knew they were watching something more dangerous than fists, the power of restraint. The question filled the silence louder than any cheer could have. Would Chuck choose to finish it, or prove again that true strength meant stopping short? The gym exploded the moment Chuck lowered his leg. Kids clapped above their heads, voices breaking with excitement. Parents shouted, "That's mastery!" Coaches who'd sat stone-faced all afternoon finally leaned forward, nodding. It wasn't just applause, it was recognition. Everyone in the room understood that what they'd witnessed was precise, deliberate control. The teenagers' friends fell silent, their bravado drained. For a beat, they sat gaping. Then, embarrassed by their own quiet, started chanting louder than ever. "Fight! Don't stop!" Their words bounced off the bleachers, hollow and forced. On the mat, the young fighter forced a grin back onto his face. It didn't reach his eyes. He bounced on his toes, tugged at his belt, laughed too loudly. Gestures that looked more like a man patching holes than projecting strength. His eyes kept darting back to that inch of air where Chuck's foot had hovered. Chuck didn't change at all. He didn't raise a fist, didn't harvest the applause with a smile. He stood exactly as before, calm, centered, his stillness more unsettling than any strike. That composure read as arrogance, even though he offered no arrogance. It was the silence of someone who knew he didn't need to prove anything. "Don't play with me! Fight me!" the kid shouted suddenly, and the gym went dead quiet. His voice cracked at the edges, and the demand sounded less like bravado than desperation. The crowd split. Some cheered, urging him forward. Others booed, offended by the plea. Parents called for calm, but their voices vanished under the noise. The atmosphere thickened. Part show, part challenge, part something no one could name. Chuck stepped forward. Just one step. The reaction was instant. A rolling ooh from the crowd, as if he had thrown a knockout blow. The referee froze mid-gesture, unsure whether to intervene. The MC lifted his microphone, then lowered it again. Cameras tightened their zoom, operators holding their breath. The young fighter latched onto the noise, desperate to rebuild his ground. He snapped a jab toward Chuck's chest, then another. Both touched cloth but landed with no weight. Chuck absorbed them without answer, his eyes never shifting. "More!" someone screamed. Another voice, older, rasped back, "Watch and learn!" The kid circled faster, sweat dripping now, his breathing ragged. He feinted low, threw a kick high, spun for a back fist. Every strike cut empty space. Chuck's movements were tiny, an elbow turned, a step angled, a parry that redirected without drama. Each miss widened the gap between noise and reality. Frustration burned red on the boy's cheeks. He pressed harder, his movements sloppy with urgency. He overreached on a cross, and that's when Chuck moved. A hand caught his wrist, not hard, not twisting, just holding. With the other hand, Chuck touched the triceps, guiding his momentum sideways. It was like someone had pressed pause. For the first time, there was contact. The gym leaned in. You could almost hear the whisper that followed. Chuck's lips barely moved. "You're not fighting me. You're fighting yourself." The boy's eyes widened, anger colliding with fear. He froze, chest locked halfway through a breath. The crowd sensed the shift. A hush spread outward, as if the whole gym had caught the echo of that private sentence. The boy ripped free, too roughly, ashamed of his hesitation. His friends tried to restart their chant, but it sounded distant, as though coming from behind a closed door. The arena had already tilted. Chuck stepped back, restoring space, his hands lowering as if he'd put a dangerous tool away. The referee hesitated, then let it go. Coaches in the stands nodded, reading the moment for what it was. Not a contest, but a lesson. The fighter barked out a laugh, brittle and humorless. He set his stance hard, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. The crowd pressed forward, torn between wanting a finish and fearing what that finish might look like. "Again," he muttered, this time to himself. Chuck gave him nothing, no taunt, no smile, only the same stillness that had unraveled him from the start. The silence weighed more than the cheers. The young man's grin vanished completely. What showed instead was the raw face of a fighter stripped of his theater. Talented, young, furious at himself. He inhaled sharply, gathering everything left into a final rush. And the gym felt it. An edge, a tremor before something breaks. Parents gripped the rails, kids clutched their belts, phones tilted higher, recording. The air itself seemed to tighten. The boy edged forward, trembling with choices. Chuck waited, unchanged. The room understood it wasn't watching a fight anymore. It was watching pride collide with patience. And as the scoreboard clock ticked louder than it should, the whole gym leaned toward the mat, holding its breath, waiting to see which force would break first. The echo of that brief contact hadn't left the room. You could feel it in the way people held their breath too long, in the way the teenager's chant kept failing to find its pitch. The young fighter tried to shake it off with motion, hands flicking, feet pattering, shoulders rolling like he could loose doubt by vibration. He glanced at his friends, drew strength from their raised phones, then fixed his eyes back on the man in front of him. He surged again, not cleaner, louder. The combinations had weight, but no argument. Jab to cross to hook. A knee rammed in from too far, the heel of his foot whipping a crescent through the air because the crowd loved crescents. Chuck's answers were not counters so much as edits. A forearm met a knee and set it down without scolding. A palm ghosted a wrist, and the hook arrived where nobody lived. He floated an inch, turned a shoulder, and let the kid punch out syllables that didn't make a sentence. "Control," the referee said. And for the first time, it sounded like she was coaching the room. The boy bared his teeth at himself and added speed like gasoline. He pressed Chuck toward the corner tape and tried to turn presence into wall. Chuck gave half a step, then a quarter, never flat-footed, never hurried, and the corner became a place with doors. He slipped out one, and the kid hit air where certainty should have been. From the bleachers, the noises changed shape. Less heckling, more involuntary exclamations that bubbled up when bodies recognized geometry before minds did. A father with a whistle around his neck said nothing for the first time all afternoon. A little girl with a yellow belt gripped its knot and whispered, "Watch his feet," without knowing where she'd learned to say it. The kid rushed again, trying to drown thought in effort. His breath went square and heavy. The floor under him began to feel sticky. His legs asked his lungs to write checks they hadn't budgeted for. He touched leather to cloth and took it as proof, then touched air again and spent the proof's interest twice over. Chuck's stillness started to feel like a trick he couldn't expose. The older man declined obvious shots with a patience that read as cruelty if you were thirsty for violence. It wasn't cruelty. It was a refusal to make the lesson about anything else. The boy feinted high and drove a straight left. Clean, functional, the kind of strike that earns nods from judges and no applause. It landed on Chuck's guard with a dull, satisfying sound. The room rewarded the honesty with a murmur that felt more like respect than cheering ever had. Chuck's eyes ticked warmer. Barely. It was approval, and it stung. He followed with a textbook low kick, 2 steps of build-up, good distance. Shin met shin, and both men adjusted with the tiny grimace of practitioners acknowledging a boundary. The boy felt his confidence climb a rung. The crowd felt their own chests loosen. He stepped again to repeat it. And Chuck stepped into his timing, not to hurt him, but to own the beat. A light check at the hip, a turn of the torso that made the kick argue with the rest of its body, and suddenly the kid stood square where he'd meant to stand bladed. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet theft of position. Frustration rose like heat off summer asphalt. He tried a spinning back kick. It cut a bright line through air and came back with nothing on it. He tried a back fist. Chuck's elbow folded an inch, and the glove skimmed past like a moth toward a lamp that wasn't on. He threw a head kick high enough for a poster. The poster stayed blank. The sounds from the stands kept clipping. Start, stop, swallow. A coach rested his chin in his palm and watched with the loneliness of a man who recognized a truth arriving in public where it hurts most. 2 boys in the front row, who had been loud all morning, said nothing now, their mouths open, eyes wide, as if they were watching a bridge being built over a gap in themselves. The kid's chest hammered. He told himself to reset, and the body refused. He tried to remember how it felt before the room changed temperature, and memory went missing. He was fighting the delay between intent and action, that terrible half-beat where frustration lives and grows teeth. Chuck didn't offer a finish. He offered air. He replaced spaces that the kid vacated with quiet, not force, until the young man found himself swinging at the way things used to be. Another rush, all hips and glare. Chuck slid inside, hand to forearm, palm to shoulder. Not a lock, not a crank, just enough to make motion accountable. He held him for a single second, eyes level, and said something the crowd couldn't hear. The kid heard it, and it hit a memory he didn't know still had a door. He recoiled like he'd been touched with a live wire, not from pain, from recognition. Pride threw up its armor. He snarled an inarticulate sound with too much throat and not enough breath. He wanted to drown the sentence he'd just been handed by moving. Movement failed him. Respect, the head official warned, softer now, her voice landing on the syllable that mattered. The boy's friends tried to chant his name back into being. The chant fell apart under the rafters like paper in rain. The gym was listening to a different story, the one whose language is foot placement and patience, whose nouns are angles and breath. He bent his knees, weight low, and shot a double rhythm, a jab to draw guard, a cross to split it. Chuck didn't bite. He slid on the outside line and tapped the glove with 2 fingers. Not a block, a punctuation mark. The boy felt condescension and looked up to find none. That was worse. He went to the well of spectacle, a wheel kick that could crown a knight if the other man believed in crowns. Chuck stepped through the arc, shoulder-grazing fabric, and ended up so near the kid's planted leg that the crowd tasted the word sweep without anyone saying it. He didn't take it. He stood there a beat, near enough to end the round with applause, and declined the applause. You could hear something break that wasn't bone. It was a sound made of pride admitting it was tired. The kid blinked fast. Moisture gathered at the edges of his eyes, heat and humiliation mixing into something older than either. He bowed quickly, then remembered, and bowed again, properly this time. When he rose, his expression had lost the shine of show. What replaced it wasn't defeat. It was weight. Chuck inclined his head a fraction, a teacher's acknowledgement not of surrender, but of attention. The boy inhaled through his nose, counted, and let it out through his mouth. He set his stance with less noise. His next punch came straight and honest. It missed by a hair, and the miss didn't wreck him. He threw again, not faster, but truer. The crowd, primed for explosions, felt the room deepen instead. Somewhere a phone buzzed itself off a knee onto the floor. Ignored. The MC discovered he'd been holding his mic uselessly for minutes and lowered it. The cameraman stopped hunting angles and held to the human scene. A young man meeting the end of his own story and deciding whether to keep reading. The exchange kept moving, but the fight had changed address. What had begun as a dare had become a mirror. The kid's attacks were now attempts at honesty more than applause. He landed to the body once, a fair touch, and looked almost surprised to have earned it. Chuck nodded. Yes, and reset the distance with an economy that felt like kindness, the way a firm no can feel like love when it arrives on time. The teenagers tried one last time. Finish him! It sounded ugly now, out of tune with the room. A mother shushed them without looking away from the mat. A coach murmured, "Let him get there." And nobody asked where there was. The boy set for one more entry. Nothing fancy. A straight step in off the rear foot. The sweat on his cheek caught light. His jaw unclenched. The noise of his friends dissolved into a hum he didn't need. He moved. Chuck waited. Not to punish, not to spare, but to choose the version of truth that would hold in the boy after the crowd went home. And the gym felt the new math. This wasn't about winning the round. It was about whether a young fighter could understand a sentence his muscles didn't want to hear, and whether an older one would let the lesson land with mercy or with consequence. The clock ticked, louder than it should. Air shifted over the vents in a cool sigh that swept the back rows. The head official's hands hovered at the edge of stopping and didn't. The room leaned, whole and breathless, toward what everyone suspected had to come next. The boy's chest rose and fell like a piston, his GI darkening with sweat at the shoulders. His friends kept calling from the bleachers, but their voices barely reached him now. They sounded distant, hollow, like shouts through a hallway door. What filled his ears instead was his own pulse, drumming behind the eyes, telling him this moment would either define him or bury him. He clenched his fists tighter, the leather squeaking, and let anger burn through the ache in his arms. "One more," he whispered to himself. Then louder, toward the man who hadn't broken a sweat. "This is it." Chuck didn't answer. He simply waited, his shoulders loose, his breathing quiet and steady. That calm hit harder than any strike. It told the boy, and everyone watching, that the storm had already been measured, weighed, and filed away. The kid exploded forward, no more feints, no more flourishes. A straight right, thrown with every ounce of weight left in his frame. The sound of his foot planting echoed across the gym floor like a gunshot. Chuck didn't retreat. He shifted just enough, letting the punch graze cloth but not skin. The boy, off balance, added a hook, then a knee, then a desperate elbow. Wild, dangerous, real. The crowd gasped. Parents pulled their kids closer on the benches. This was no longer exhibition. This was someone fighting not for victory, but for pride's survival. Chuck's defense stayed infuriatingly simple. One hand guiding the elbow offline, the other checking the knee, his body turning with the strikes instead of against them. It looked effortless, but it carried the sharp edge of mastery, the kind that had been forged decades before any of these kids were born. The boy roared, face twisted, and launched the last card in his deck, a spinning back kick. His heel tore through the air, aiming square at Chuck's chest with force that could break ribs if it landed. The bleachers shook with screams. Some begged for contact, others begged for restraint. Time slowed. Chuck stepped in. His hand met the kick before it peaked, redirecting it past his side. In the same motion, his other hand pressed lightly at the boy's shoulder, shifting his weight just enough. The young fighter's leg collapsed under him, and he dropped hard to one knee. The sound wasn't loud, but it cracked the gym open. People shot to their feet, half cheering, half stunned. Kids clapped wildly. Parents shouted his name. Coaches exchanged long looks, knowing they'd just seen something that would be repeated for years. Chuck didn't follow up. He didn't strike. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped back, giving the boy room to rise. His words carried clear, steady, unshaken. Respect starts here. The gym froze. Phones caught every syllable. The boy lifted his head slowly. His breathing was ragged, his face flushed, but his eyes were something new. Not only defeat, not only shame. There was recognition there, a flash of understanding tangled with something darker, resentment that the lesson had come in front of so many witnesses. The crowd erupted again, louder than before, but the boy didn't hear it. He stayed on one knee, jaw tight, staring at Chuck with a mix of humiliation and hunger. The camera zoomed in, holding that face, the storm in it. 1,000 people were watching the same thing, but drawing different conclusions. Some saw a student humbled. Others saw a fighter plotting revenge. And as Chuck turned slightly, his calm unchanged, the question lingered in every corner of the gym. Would the young man rise with respect, or with rage?